So back to our Vidly application, I've got Postman open, and I'm going to send a post request to our rentals endpoint. And here in the body of the request, we have a valid customer ID and movie ID. Now let me show you what happens if we change this object ID to a value like 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is not a valid object ID. Let's send this request. You can see this is hanging there. And if you look at the terminal, you see this error, unhandled promise rejection, which basically means we had a promise that was rejected, but we didn't handle that properly. Now, as I told you before, we have a separate section about error handling and logging in the course, so let's not worry about this part, but look at the error message. Cast to object ID failed for value 1, 2, 3, 4 at pass underline ID for model customer. This message may sound a little bit too technical or confusing, but I'm going to make it really simple for you. So here, we're talking about this model, customer, or customer class. We're talking about the ID property. In Mongoose, you see the word path because path can represent a chain of properties. For example, a customer can have address, and address can have street. So that's why we use path. Now here Mongoose is complaining that it could not cast the value 1, 2, 3, 4 to object ID. Obviously because 1, 2, 3, 4 is not a valid object ID. But the issue we have in our implementation is that first of all, we are not getting a response here. This request is hanging. We have not handled this situation properly. And we're getting this error in terminal. In this situation, when we send an invalid customer ID, we should get a 400 error. That's a bad request because the server cannot fulfill this request. So back in rentals.js, this is the handler for creating a new rental. On the top, we are validating the request, and this ensures that in our request, we have a customer ID and a movie ID, but it doesn't care if these values are valid object IDs. That exception was thrown on this line, on line 20. So when we try to find a customer by ID, if we pass an invalid object ID, that's when we get that exception. So one way to fix this problem is like this. If mongoose.types.objectID.isValid, so we pass request.body.customerID. Now if this is not valid, we're going to return the 400 error. So status 400 with a message like invalid customer. And then we have to repeat the same for validating the movie ID property. However, this is a bad implementation. This is a bad approach to solve this problem because earlier we defined this function to validate our request. So this logic really belongs to this function. So in this function, we want to make sure that customer ID is a string, it has a value, and it's a valid object ID. So if the input is in the right shape, then we go to the database to find that customer, okay? So I'm going to delete these two lines from here. Let's go back to our validate function. So that's in rental.js. Here is our validate rental function. Now here we need to add custom validation because we need to talk to Mongoose. We need to call the isValid method of object ID type. Now extending this validation is a little bit complex and you don't want to repeat that every time you have a validate function. There is actually an NPM package for adding support to validating object IDs in Joy. So back in the terminal, let's install Joy-object ID. So note that the current version I'm using is version 2.0.0. Now back in the code, here in rental.js, on the top, we need to load this module. So require Joy-object ID. Now this returns a function. We need to call this function and pass a reference to this Joy module. So we pass Joy here. And by the way, you don't have to memorize this. You can simply look at the NPM documentation. Now the result of this is a function. So we can set joy.objectID to this function. So object ID is a method on this joy object. Actually, it's better to use a capital I here. Now back to our validate function. So here I'm going to change the definition of this customer ID from joy.string to joy.object ID. That's the method that we defined on top of this module, right? And it's also required. We're going to make the same change for the movie ID property. So object ID. Now, back in the terminal, let's run the application again. Here in Postman, I'm going to send a request with this invalid customer ID. Send. Okay, look, we got a bad request. Customer ID with value 1234 fails to match the required pattern. And this is a regular expression that represents a valid object ID. And if you look in the terminal, see, we no longer get that unhandled promise rejection.